It is really incredible how often the most profound systemic failures are just entirely invisible to the people trapped inside them.
Oh, absolutely. They just become the wallpaper.
Right, exactly. So welcome back, everyone, to part 5 of our 8-part deep dive into the literal mechanics of human organizing. And if you've been with us through the previous 4 parts, we're systematically dismantling these soft sociological illusions of the modern workplace.
And replacing them with hard, uncompromising physics.
Yes, exactly. But before we get into the core of today's mission, I want to pull a thread from the very end of our last discussion because it perfectly sets the stage for the reality we are about to unpack today.
It is the perfect bridge, really, and it's an image that just really stuck with me when we were reviewing the source material. It's so absurd, but it highlights the exact problem we're facing.
Right, so let's set the scene for now. Picture the break room in a massive corporate office, and sitting on the counter is this highly complex commercial-grade espresso machine. But it has suffered a total mechanical failure.
Like a catastrophic breakdown?
Yeah. Water is pooling on the linoleum. The internal pump has completely seized up. The gears are just locked solid. It is a physical structural breakdown. And instead of, calling a mechanic or grabbing a wrench, management decides to intervene using the modern corporate playbook.
Which is just hilarious.
Right. They sit the machine down, they tell it that its morning contributions are highly valued, and they buy it a premium subscription to a mindfulness app.
Which is a comedic extreme, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But the solution fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the problem. You can't meditate your way out of a broken gear.
Exactly. And what was the result of that absurdity? Zero coffee. But because the machine was still plugged in, still receiving electrical current while its gears were completely seized, it generated massive amounts of waste heat. It was basically baking itself from the inside out.
And this is where the metaphor pivots away from the break room and points directly at you, the listener. Because when you are forced to constantly switch between deep, complex work,
like writing a piece of software or, parsing a nuanced legal document.
Right, or strategizing a marketing campaign. When you do that and simultaneously answer a relentless barrage of synchronous chat pings and email notifications, your brain becomes that seized coffee machine.
I really want to pause here because I know what you're probably thinking right now, because I thought the exact same thing when I read this. You might be sitting there thinking, well, I feel overwhelmed sometimes, sure, but I'm just stressed. But you're saying this isn't just a feeling.
No, it is a physiological reality. Your biological engine is spinning at maximum RPM. You are generating pure thermal exhaust, which is what you experience as biological stress and burnout. But because of the constant unyielding interruptions, you are producing absolutely zero forward kinetic velocity.
You're just vibrating in place.
Exactly. You are vibrating in place, burning up your cellular fuel, and outputting nothing of structural value.
And that is the urgent, eye-opening mission of today's deep dive. Today, we are completely dismantling the corporate delusion of multitasking. We are going to explore the hard physics of a phenomenon called context thrashing.
And we're going to audit your brain's biological ATP tax and introduce you to a physics concept called Landauer's erasure.
Yeah, and by the end of this hour, I promise you will never look at a sudden quick question from a coworker the same way ever again.
Because we're going to look at the data proving that what corporate leadership culturally praises as, agility or dynamic responsiveness
is actually, in the realm of hard physics and cognitive neuroscience, a mathematical impossibility. It's a structural flaw that is destroying the global workforce.
It really is. So think about the last time you were, completely in the zone, just deeply focused.
Oh, yeah, the elusive flow state.
Right. Exactly. Like you've been working on this really complex problem for, an hour, holding a dozen different variables in your head, and then a Slack ping pops up.
Always a Slack ping. Or Teams.
Yeah, always. There's a colleague asking a quick question, and it takes you maybe 10 seconds to read it, fire off a reply, and harmless.
Yeah, that's what we tell ourselves.
Exactly. But what if I told you that tiny 10-second interruption didn't just distract you? What if I told you it physically destroyed cellular fuel in your brain?
Which sounds like science fiction, but it's really not.
It's not. And that it triggers this physiological defense mechanism that causes a 23-minute cognitive blackout.
I mean, it is a terrifying reality when you actually look at the biology of what a notification does to a human being. We treat interruptions like they're just minor annoyances, but they aren't. They are literal thermodynamic events.
Thermodynamic events.
So let's look at CEO 8. This is our archetype of the thermodynamic executive from the source material. It's 10:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. 8 is standing quietly behind the workstation of his lead autonomous routing architect.
And what he's witnessing is essentially a slow-motion biological car crash.
It's the defining tableau of the modern knowledge worker, right? On the architect's primary monitor, you have these incredibly complex pathing algorithms compiling, deep, high-dimensional mathematical work.
But right next to it, on the secondary monitor, there's a corporate chat channel, scrolling continuously. Status updates, direct messages, and those dreaded "here" alerts firing off every 12 seconds.
Just relentless incoming fire, and the architect's eyes are darting frantically back and forth between the deep code and the synchronous chat.
And right at that moment, the director of engineering walks by, looks at the architect, and smiles. He points to the guy and says, look at that hustle. He's an incredible parallel processor.
Which triggers an immediate rejection from 8. He doesn't smile at all. He reaches over and physically unplugs the secondary chat monitor.
Just pulls the plug.
Yeah. And he states a biological absolute. He says there is no such thing as a parallel processor in mammalian anatomy. And he warns the director that he is watching a single-core engine thrashing its gears.
And he warns that if they do not stop interrupting this architect's flow state, the employee will suffer a dielectric breakdown.
A dielectric breakdown. Explain that.
It's when the biological insulation around the neural pathways literally starts to degrade.
Wow. I want to stick to that phrase, single-core engine, because the entire modern corporate enterprise is basically built upon this assumption that the human brain can operate like a parallel processing computer.
That we can just run multiple demanding applications at exactly the same time.
Right. It's an assumption driven by this desperate mandate for productivity. The unstated rule in every legacy corporate hierarchy is that you, the knowledge worker, can seamlessly synthesize a strategic brief, monitor a hyperactive chat channel, respond to emails, and, listen in on a video conference, all simultaneously.
But you can't.
Okay, I have to push back here, because I can hear the objections from our audience. Let's look at everyday life. I can walk down the street and chew gum at the same time.
Sure.
I can listen to a highly complex podcast like this one while I'm out for a run. I can drive a car down the highway while having a deep conversation with a passenger. Isn't that multitasking? Aren't we biologically capable of parallel processing in those instances? I do it every day.
That is a very common counterargument, and the source material addresses it directly because there's a crucial distinction here. What you are describing is only possible when one of those processes is entirely automated by a specific region of the brain called the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia. So that's like the body's autopilot system.
Precisely. When you are walking or chewing gum or driving a route you've taken 100 times, your prefrontal cortex,
which is the executive control center of your brain, right? The part that handles active thinking.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex is not calculating the physics of putting one foot in front of the other. The basal ganglia has completely automated that routine. It runs in the background. Because of that, your prefrontal cortex is free to process the podcast or the conversation.
Ah, I see.
But, and this is where the corporate delusion shatters, when the prefrontal cortex is required to toggle between two complex, non-automated variables, the system fundamentally breaks down.
So if I'm parsing a dense legal contract, and then I get an instant message from my boss asking for a nuanced update on a different project.
Neither of those tasks can be handed off to the basal ganglia. You haven't automated reading a specific legal clause, and you haven't automated analyzing your boss's question.
Right. They both require the active, full engagement of the prefrontal cortex.
Yes. And the mammalian brain operates as a strictly sequential, single-core processor. When confronted with two demanding cognitive tasks, it cannot execute them concurrently. It must forcefully suspend one context in order to load another.
It's not parallel processing at all. It is rapid, continuous task switching.
Yes. In cognitive physics, this is known as context thrashing. And psychology has repeatedly demonstrated that this continuous toggling is not an act of agility. It creates immense systemic friction that exacts a heavy physiological toll.
The numbers on this degradation metric are honestly staggering. According to the data in the sources, engaging in this rapid task switching triggers a performance degradation of up to 40%.
It's massive.
It introduces exponential increases in error rates. And this is the one that really gets me. It induces a state of temporary cognitive impairment that is the equivalent of losing 10 IQ points.
10 IQ points just wiped off the board because you checked a notification while trying to write a report. You are temporarily making yourself less intelligent to accommodate this culture of constant availability.
That is terrifying. So as you sit at your desk tomorrow with 3 monitors glowing, taking pride in replying to emails within 40 seconds while coding, you have to realize you aren't a superhero. You are a single-core engine continuously dropping your context, severely degrading your output quality, and paying a massive biological tax to do it.
And to truly understand the sheer lethality of this biological limit, we have to step out of the office for a moment. Because in the corporate world, what we call productivity theater can mask the consequences.
Right. If an office worker drops the ball on a line of code because they were checking Slack, it might just cause a bug that gets patched next week. The stakes feel low, so the delusion that multitasking works just, persists.
Exactly. To see the reality of the single-core brain, we must look at an environment where the physical constraints of human cognition cannot be masked by corporate buzzwords. We have to look at aviation,
where the failure to respect the absolute limits of sequential processing results in physical destruction.
Yes. The source material provides a deeply tragic but essential diagnostic case study here. On August 20, 2008, Spanner Flight 5022, which was an MD-82 aircraft, attempted to take off from Madrid. The aircraft crashed, tragically killing 154 people.
What?
When the investigation concluded, it revealed that the highly trained flight crew had attempted the takeoff with the wing flaps improperly set. They hadn't configured the plane for lift.
And when you dive into the NASA Aviation Safety Reporting System, this wasn't an isolated anomaly. The text notes a terrifying pattern. Over 50 incidents in a single decade where pilots attempted no-flap takeoffs, alongside countless reports of incorrectly set trim, airspeed, and heading bugs.
And what's fascinating here, from a cognitive perspective, is that the human factors engineers determined these were not failures of skill. These pilots were veterans. They had thousands of hours of flight time.
So it wasn't a failure of training either.
No, it was a catastrophic failure of task management under the pressures of concurrent synchronous demands.
The text calls this cognitive lockup.
Yes, cognitive lockup or cognitive tunneling. When pilots are bombarded with communication glitches, air traffic control radio chatter, an alarm going off, and checklist interruptions, their cognitive architecture experiences a complete failure to switch tasks effectively. When operators are forced into these dual tasking scenarios, physiological measurements like EEGs and functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRS,
which measures blood oxygen levels in the brain, right?
Right. These tools detect massive spikes in mental workload. The brain's energy demands rapidly exceed the operator's available metabolic capacity. The prefrontal cortex is demanding more oxygen and energy than the body can supply in that instant.
So the brain is essentially starving for energy in that moment.
It's entirely overwhelmed by the energy demands of managing multiple synchronous inputs. So what does the biological defense mechanism do? It simply drops critical threads to prevent total metabolic collapse.
It has to.
Right. The brain forcefully narrows its focus to a single point, entirely ignoring other blaring alarms or critical checklist items just to survive the energetic overload.
I want to bring this right back to you, the listener, sitting at your desk. If highly trained, elite pilots operating in a life-or-death environment, people whose survival depends on flawless execution, cannot safely process a minor interruption, like a radio glitch or a flight attendant call chime, without dropping a critical takeoff configuration.
The idea that a mid-level office worker can seamlessly pivot between writing a complex software algorithm and fielding a synchronous chat notification is fundamentally absurd.
It's organizational malpractice. What occurs in the modern office every single day is an invisible, silent equivalent of these aviation disasters. Every single time you are interrupted, your brain must momentarily release the deeply encoded context of the primary task.
It has to expend metabolic energy to clear those neural pathways, grasp the entirely different parameters of the interruption, and then try to reload the original context.
It makes me think of Cal Newport's concept of the hyperactive hive mind, which the source material leans on heavily. The modern corporate workflow is centered around this unstructured, highly synchronous, improvisational, back-and-forth messaging.
But as Newport points out, this is a communication architecture meant for 3 hunter-gatherers scanning the horizon for predators.
Yeah, and we have disastrously scaled that exact same biological communication model to tens of thousands of knowledge workers in a global enterprise.
We've put tens of thousands of people into a giant digital room and told them to constantly tap each other on the shoulder all day long while trying to invent the future of technology.
It's madness. And the result is an environment where cognitive demands exponentially exceed cognitive supply. The executive leadership looks at this and assumes it's, I don't know, a software configuration issue.
Or they blame the employee, claiming it's a failure of time management or lack of resilience.
But it's not a mindset issue. It is a fundamental hardware limitation bound by the inescapable laws of thermodynamics. If we take that biological reality and zoom out to the strict laws of computation and physics, things get incredibly clear.
Because to fully grasp the sheer magnitude of this energy leak, we have to look at the concept of CPU thrashing and Landauer's principle.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the text sets this up with another brilliant scene involving CEO 8.
It's 1:15 p.m. 8 is reviewing the digital telemetry of his marketing division. Now, this department is theoretically responsible for generating demand, but they have not shipped a major campaign in 3 months. Nothing has actually gone out the door.
Naturally, 8 calls in the VP of marketing to demand an explanation, and the VP, desperate to justify their headcount and defend their team, points to the internal communication metrics on the dashboard as proof of an intense, highly collaborative work ethic.
The VP says, look at these numbers. We've sent 14,000 chat messages this week. We've resolved 4,000 internal threads. We have logged 80 hours of synchronous video calls. We are working incredibly hard.
And CEO 8 just stares at the dashboard, his voice completely flat, and says, you are not measuring productivity. You are measuring thermal exhaust. Your team is not collaborating. Your team is functionally paralyzed.
Thermal exhaust. It's a ruthless application of physics to corporate theater. Because to grasp the biological energy leak, you have to discard the soft, forgiving language of management theory and look at the unforgiving science of computation. Let's start with CPU thrashing.
Right, so let's break this down for anyone who hasn't studied systems architecture. What exactly is a computer doing when it starts thrashing?
Well, in computer science, a machine's capacity to execute tasks is strictly constrained by its physical random access memory, its RAM. That's its short-term workspace. When a system is subjected to a load of concurrent processes that exceeds its available RAM, the operating system attempts a desperate compensation maneuver. It starts using virtual memory.
Okay, so it essentially tries to fake having more RAM by using the hard drive.
Exactly. It begins rapidly swapping pages of data back and forth between the high-speed physical RAM and the much slower secondary storage disk. Now, the frequency of these concurrent demands accelerates beyond a critical threshold. The operating system enters a fatal state known as CPU thrashing.
And thrashing is a thermodynamic dead end.
It is the ultimate state of systemic paralysis. It occurs when a system is so overwhelmed with competing concurrent processes that it spends more resources swapping data in and out of memory than it does executing actual mathematical tasks.
The source material gets wonderfully technical here. It describes the machine being locked in an unwinnable race against translation look-aside buffer misses, or TLB misses.
Wait, before we go further, could you give us an ELI 5, and explain it like I'm 5 on what a TLB miss actually is? I don't want to lose anyone of the jargon here.
Absolutely. Think of a computer's memory like a massive library. The RAM is the desk you're working at, and the hard drive is the endless stacks of books in the back.
Okay, desk and stacks, got it. The translation look-aside buffer, the TLB, is like a small, super fast index card box sitting right on your desk that tells you exactly where the most common books are located.
Oh, so it's a shortcut to find things quickly.
Exactly. But when you are overwhelmed with too many tasks, the machine asks for a piece of data, and the address isn't in that quick index box. That is a TLB miss. Because the shortcut isn't there, the system has to perform what's called a page walk.
A page walk? That sounds slow.
It is. It's like the librarian having to get up, walk to the master catalog, slowly look up the physical location of the book, walk to the stacks, and bring it back. It is a high latency, incredibly slow action.
So let's visualize this. The machine is doing an immense amount of internal work. It is spinning its disks, moving electrons at frantic speeds, the cooling fans are screaming. It looks incredibly busy.
But it is yielding absolutely zero output. It is producing zero actual math.
It is exactly what the VP of marketing was praising. 14,000 chat messages and 80 hours of video calls. Intense internal movement yielding zero shipped campaigns.
But this computational paralysis isn't just an engineering inefficiency. It is inextricably linked to a fundamental law of physics.
Which brings us to Landauer's principle, the physical cost of forgetting.
This is where the framework becomes truly paradigm shifting. In 1961, a physicist named Rolf Landauer, working at IBM, proposed a concept that bridged information theory and physical thermodynamics. He solved a physics paradox by demonstrating a brutal reality. Information is physical, and destroying it requires a sacrifice of energy.
This blew my mind when I first read it in the sources. To understand this, we have to look at the difference between adding data and erasing data.
Let's start with writing data. In theoretical physics, there is a concept known as reversible computing. Writing new data, like typing a new character into a completely blank document, is simply the act of organizing empty space.
Okay.
In a perfectly efficient computational system, the theoretical minimum energy required for the machine to perform this physical action is zero. From the isolated perspective of the machine's memory register, obviously you, the human, type the key and burn metabolic energy. But for the machine receiving the data into an empty slot, there is no thermodynamic penalty. You are simply sliding an electron into an open slot across a frictionless surface. It is a lossless transfer.
Okay, so writing is cheap. But here is the catch. The moment you erase information, the moment you overwrite a memory state, drop a context, or delete a full page of text to make room for new data, you have permanently destroyed a prior state of order.
And you cannot reverse that equation. Landauer proved that this logical destruction of information must be mathematically paid for in blood. The destroyed information is converted into physical waste heat, and there's a strict mathematical formula for this.
And it's represented as E is greater than or equal to K sub B times T times the natural log of 2, right?
Yes, exactly. E is greater than or equal to KBTLN2. In that equation, KB is the Boltzmann constant, and T is the absolute temperature of the environment.
Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice?
Landauer's principle dictates that any irreversible change in information, like clearing a bit from a memory register to make room for a new incoming chat ping, must dissipate a minimum mathematically unavoidable amount of physical heat into the surrounding environment.
So to synthesize this for everyone listening, to forget is not a passive decay. It's not like dust settling. It is an active thermodynamic event. Erasing information physically burns energy.
Yes. When a computer experiences CPU thrashing, it isn't just moving data around. It is continuously writing and critically erasing data from its high-speed memory registries to accommodate the relentless influx of new demands.
Because of Landauer's principle, every single erasure event forces a reduction of information entropy within the memory space,
which must be perfectly compensated by an increase in thermodynamic entropy, waste heat, released into the physical environment.
The system boils itself. It transforms high-grade electrical power into useless thermal exhaust. And this is the exact corporate translation. The hierarchy assumes that human attention is free. They assume that asking an employee to switch contexts, to jump from a coding environment to a Slack channel and back again, has a zero-cost margin.
But physics proves that cognitive context is the most expensive, highly taxed commodity in the known universe. When organization mandates rapid, synchronous communication, they are inadvertently forcing their human capital to operate at the exact threshold of CPU thrashing.
Now, obviously, your brain is not made of silicon. It's wetware. But the laws of thermodynamics do not stop at the barrier of your forehead. They govern biology just as mercilessly as they govern a microprocessor. And we have to look at how this translates to the biological ATP tax.
Let's go back to CEO 8. It's 4:00 p.m., and he is sitting with his chief medical officer. The corporate health data is catastrophic. Sick leave is up 22%. Prescriptions for ADHD, stimulants, and anxiety medication among the engineering division have spiked.
The CMO says they are psychologically burning out. The resilience training isn't working.
And 8 replies with absolute structural clarity. He says resilience is a psychological concept. You are looking at a physiological failure. You are looking at an ATP deficit caused by our communication architecture. They aren't sad. They are out of cellular fuel.
To understand this, we have to conduct a neuroscience energy audit of the brain. The biological equivalent of a computer's RAM is human working memory, and the biological currency that fuels it is ATP, adenosine triphosphate.
The mammalian brain is this incredibly fragile, energy-dense engine. It only makes up about 2% of the average adult's body weight, but it commandeers roughly 20% of your body's total oxygen and caloric intake.
It is optimized for extreme efficiency, but its baseline operational costs are staggering.
The disparity in how that energy is partitioned is shocking. The fraction of ATP used for actual neural computation, the structural changes that constitute deep learning, problem solving, creating a new algorithm, is a mere zero 0.1 watts.
Just a tenth of a watt for the actual deep work.
Yes. But the energy required for long-distance neural communication, the firing of action potentials across the brain to transmit signals, demands 3.5 watts.
That is a 35-fold increase in metabolic cost simply to transmit signals.
Exactly.
Let's break down the biological mechanics of what happens when an interruption hits. You are in deep focus, writing a report, and suddenly, ping. A Slack message pops up on your screen. What is the physical cascade of events inside your skull?
First, the neurons must fire an action potential to process that sensory input. This requires voltage-gated sodium channels in the neuron to snap open, allowing an influx of sodium ions into the axon to depolarize the cell.
So sodium rushes in.
Immediately following that, potassium channels open, allowing potassium ions to rush out to repolarize the membrane. But now the cell is left with degraded ionic gradients. The sodium is on the wrong side, the potassium is on the wrong side. The battery is discharged.
It's out of balance.
To reestablish the appropriate balance of ions and prepare for the next signal, a biological machine known as the sodium-potassium pump must activate. This pump uses ATP to physically force sodium out of the cell and potassium back in, pushing them against their natural concentration gradients.
I always picture this like trying to pump water uphill. It requires active mechanical force.
Exactly. And this resetting mechanism consumes vast, measurable quantities of metabolic energy.
But as the source material points out, that is just the sensory cost of reading the ping. The true cost, the catastrophic cost, is the thermodynamic penalty of cognitive erasure.
When a software engineer is operating in a state of deep work, their neural network is sustaining a massive, high-dimensional model of the problem in their working memory. It is a delicate, highly ordered architecture.
And to process a sudden incoming message about an entirely different topic, the brain must forcefully overwrite this delicate architecture.
This is the biological application of Landauer's principle. In a computer, crossing that threshold triggers what we call a page fault. In your brain, the biological equivalent is a total wipe of your working memory. You completely lose the mental model you spent 20 minutes building.
Erasing the previous neural context to load the new context dissipates energy. Your company is taxing your finite daily energy reserves just to force you to read a status update.
The underlying physics that destroys a server room's efficiency also destroys the human brain's efficiency. Both are subject to Landauer's limit. They physically burn energy to clear working memory.
Which brings us to one of the most terrifying metrics in this entire deep dive, the 23-minute and 15-second recovery window.
The cognitive acceleration phase.
Let's explain this using the physics of inertia. Accelerating a mass from a dead stop, overcoming static inertia, requires a massive expenditure of energy. Think about pushing a heavy car that's broken down. Getting it rolling takes everything you've got. But once it reaches a steady state velocity, the energy required to just keep it moving drops exponentially.
In neurobiology, rigorous workplace research by Dr. Gloria Mark proves that it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to fully rebuild cognitive context after a disruption.
Over 23 minutes.
23 minutes. I really want that to sink in for everyone listening. You get a Slack ping, you look at it, it takes you 10 seconds to read it and type, sounds good, I'll look at it later. 10 seconds of physical interaction.
10 seconds.
But the unseen cognitive tail of that interruption, the biological reboot time, stretches for almost half an hour. That 23 minutes is the cognitive acceleration phase. It is the immense metabolic effort required to spool up the neural manifold, load the variables, and overcome static cognitive inertia.
But once you reach that steady state velocity, what we commonly call being in the flow state, the ATP burn rate stabilizes, and high-quality work is produced efficiently.
Now, we must distinguish between two types of interruptions, because this defines what the text calls the Landauer threshold. If your workflow is disturbed by a minor superficial interruption, say, someone asks a simple yes or no question like, do you want coffee?
The brain processes that disruption in its short-term buffer, what you might call the biological L1 cache.
Right. Your momentum dips momentarily, but the deep work context is not erased. You answer yes, and you go right back to the code.
But if the interruption contains complex information, if it requires spatial reasoning, learning, or pulling up a different project file, the data volume exceeds that short-term buffer.
The system crosses the Landauer threshold. To process the new information, the brain is forced to execute its version of a page fault. It must erase the original, deeply loaded context to make room for the new variables.
And once that Landauer threshold is crossed, your original momentum is permanently destroyed. You cannot just resume the prior task. You have to pay the ATP erasure tax, reload the original variables back into your working memory, and restart that brutal 23-minute cognitive acceleration phase from absolute zero.
Now, overlay that biological reality with the corporate telemetry we see today. The average knowledge worker receives over 117 emails and 153 chat messages daily.
They are suffering an interruption every 2 minutes.
Which means they never reach steady-state velocity.
Never. I mean, if it takes 23 minutes to reach flow and you are interrupted every 2 minutes, you spend your entire life in the acceleration phase. You are perpetually stuck in the reloading phase, suffering the penalties of context switching over and over.
Employees are losing up to 40% of their available productive time to this invisible thief. It equates to a 600-hour annual void. 600 hours per employee vanishing into the friction of cognitive transition.
This explains the modern burnout epidemic perfectly. It's not a lack of resilience. It is a literal cellular fuel deficit. The ATP is being depleted faster than the body can replenish it. The biological system simply crashes.
You are burning massive amounts of biological energy just swapping contexts. Maximal physiological effort yielding zero forward work.
We've mapped out the biological toll this takes on a single brain. But what happens when you scale that cognitive tunneling across an entire team managing a high-stakes, fast-moving system? Because we need to look at a macro-scale failure where this biological limit literally destroyed a company.
This takes us to the Knight Capital collapse. On August 1st, 2012, Knight Capital Group, a major financial services firm, activated a flawed piece of high-frequency trading software known as SMARS. Almost immediately, the algorithm began executing millions of erroneous orders on the market.
It was a digital runaway train. Try to picture the trading floor in that moment. The engineering and operations teams were instantly placed under immense synchronous pressure. They are facing an unrelenting barrage of communication overload. Alarms are blaring, executives are screaming, emails are flooding in. They are attempting a frantic software rollback.
But because of broken internal reporting protocols and this chaotic, hypersynchronous crisis response environment, the engineers succumbed to cognitive tunneling. Their working memory was overloaded.
The Landauer erasure tax was being paid every few seconds as they tried to parse new, conflicting instructions while debugging code.
And in that state of cognitive lockup, what did they do?
What did they do?
They accidentally reverted the system to the exact same bad code sequence that had caused the issue in the first place.
They pushed the bad code again because their working memory completely broke down under synchronous overload. And the stakes of that biological failure. In the ensuing 45 minutes of complete organizational thrashing, Knight Capital lost $440 million.
Nearly $10 million per minute.
$10 million a minute vanishing into thin air, entirely destroying the firm's independent existence. The failure wasn't just technical. It was an inability of the human operators to process complex information due to the total breakdown of working memory.
Which forces us to ask a critical question. If multitasking is an anatomical impossibility that burns through our cellular energy and destroys output at the scale of 10 million a minute, why does corporate leadership relentlessly mandate it?
Yes. If it is this destructive, why is the hyperactive hive mind the default state of almost every major company?
In psychology, you might call this a confirmation bias. But in the framework we are discussing, this is formally diagnosed as a telemetry failure. Legacy executives suffer from an inability to distinguish between kinetic velocity and thermal vibration.
Kinetic velocity versus thermal vibration. Let's unpack that.
When a physicist or an engineer observes a system, they measure directional displacement, work, forward movement. That is kinetic velocity. When a legacy manager observes a system, they simply measure movement.
They just look for activity.
Right. When an employee is subjected to rapid context thrashing, their biological engine is spinning at maximum RPM. They are typing frantically, clicking rapidly, attending 8 video calls a day, and responding to synchronous pings instantly.
To the legacy manager, this intense, localized movement looks exactly like productivity. It confirms their bias that the team is hustling.
But physics demands a vector. Movement without directional forward velocity is simply vibration. And in physical systems, intense localized vibration is the exact definition of generating waste heat.
The corporate hierarchy is mistaking the thermal friction of a seized engine for the forward velocity of a working one.
And the ultimate symbol of this telemetry failure is the green dot illusion. It's 5:00 p.m. CEO 8 is standing before his executive steering committee. The VP of Product proudly pulls up a dashboard showing that 85% of the engineering workforce has maintained an active green status indicator on the internal messaging platform long after 7:00 p.m.
The VP says they are highly dedicated. The agility is incredible.
And 8 just stares at the metric, shuts off the projector, and says, "You are tracking the wrong telemetry. A green dot is not a metric of output. It is a metric of thermal friction. You are praising them for sitting in a state of constant biological vigilance. Turn the surveillance off."
A green dot is a metric of exhaustion. It is the thermal friction of a seized engine spinning at maximum RPM. Every synchronous messaging tool deployed within an enterprise acts as an active parasitic drain on the organization's metabolic capacity.
So if multitasking is a myth, if context thrashing burns our ATP and destroys our output, and if chat platforms are parasitic, how do we fix a machine?
CEO 8 performs some radical triage here that serves as a great micro-case study. It's Monday morning. 8 audits the communication telemetry of a newly acquired software subsidiary. There are 400 active Slack channels for a team of just 150 people. The general channel is registering a new synchronous ping every 14 seconds.
The demand for a new context every 14 seconds.
Exactly. So 8 doesn't send out an HR memo asking for better chat etiquette. He contacts the enterprise IT director and orders the immediate permanent deletion of the entire server instance. He unplugs the machine.
And the subsidiary CEO panics. He says, "How will we communicate? We need that for our agile culture."
And 8 replies, "Your culture is a localized heat death. We are moving to an asynchronous architecture. But I have to ask, how does a company actually function without chat? Doesn't the whole operation just grind to a halt? How do people ask quick questions?"
It's the most common fear, but the empirical data points to the exact opposite. If hypersynchronous communication is a thermodynamic failure, the solution requires the architectural elimination of the required switching events. We have to look at the software company Basecamp, also known as 37 Signals.
They serve as the premier model of an organization that has engineered an environment with zero context thrashing.
Basecamp recognized early on that the hyperactive hive mind was a disaster. Forcing professionals to maintain dozens of synchronous conversations does not scale.
So they outlawed it. They built their internal operational framework on hard constraints designed specifically to protect the cognitive capacity of their workforce. And they implemented 3 core rules.
First, asynchronous default.
Internal communication is entirely based on long-form writing. They explicitly do not use external chat tools internally. By relying on asynchronous documents, employees process information in massive batches rather than continuous streams.
Second, the eradication of urgency.
They operate under the philosophy that urgency is contagious, toxic, and usually unnecessary. There is zero expectation of an immediate response to any internal communication. By removing the threat of the instant ping, the biological node is never forced into a defensive, vigilant state.
And third, information permanence. The text calls this a negentropic structure.
Chat is highly entropic. It's a fragmented mess where no one can find anything, which requires constant recommunication. By moving to long-form, asynchronous posts with permanent links, the system maintains strict structural integrity.
The context is held by the architecture, not the human brain. The employee never has to execute a search through their memory to find lost data. The system holds it for them.
When a developer at Basecamp codes, they are granted vast, uninterrupted blocks of time to cross the cognitive acceleration phase and construct highly complex mental models. Because there is no chat channel to monitor, the Landauer limit is mathematically respected. Their biological energy is converted at near 100% efficiency into pure work.
Basecamp isn't the only one doing this. Let's look at Shopify's Armenian. Shopify leadership recognized they were bleeding capacity, so they executed a useful subtraction. They retroactively deleted all recurring meetings with more than 2 people across the entire global enterprise.
They instantly eradicated 10,000 synchronous events from employee calendars.
10,000 events.
They freed up 76,500 hours of cognitive capacity overnight. I love the quote from their COO, Kosnajation. He said, "No one at Shopify would expense a $500 dinner, but lots and lots of people spend way more than that in meetings without ever making a decision."
It's brilliant energy reclamation. They simply stopped setting their employees' cognitive resources workforce is on fire.
Which perfectly brings us to the executive actions you need to consider. What are the concrete steps you must take tomorrow morning to protect your team's output?
To understand the urgency, we have to look at Price's law. Price's law demonstrates that in any productive system, 50% of the total output is achieved by the square root of the total workforce.
So in a company of 10,000 employees, merely 100 individuals are responsible for half the forward kinetic velocity.
We categorize this elite echelon as the 21% cohort. These are the system architects, the deep work coders, the strategic modelers. Their work is highly complex, requiring massive working memory loads.
Subjecting this specific cohort to context thrashing is an act of corporate self-sabotage that mathematically destroys the firm's output potential.
So to protect them, you must enact 4 ruthless directives. Directive 1, eradicate immediate response expectation. Moving communication to asynchronous channels saves roughly 60% of time and definitively reduces the error rates caused by cognitive tunneling.
Directive 2, implement strict phase boundaries. In classical thermodynamics, a phase boundary is a closed surface separating distinct physical states, preventing unwanted heat transfer and isolating systems so clean work can be extracted. Think of the thick metal walls of an engine cylinder.
You must construct unbreakable phase boundaries around your most productive cohort. They must be structurally shielded from administrative pings, reply-all chains, and low-value meetings. Their time blocks must be isolated to prevent contamination.
Directive 3, mandate batch processing. Stop streaming data continuously. Batch it to 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening. By batching communication, the brain only pays the Landauer erasure tax once per session, protecting that 23-minute cognitive acceleration phase.
And Directive 4, measure exergy, not availability.
Wait, you keep using the word exergy. Before we go further, how is that different from just regular energy?
That's a great distinction. In thermodynamics, energy is a broad term, but exergy specifically refers to the portion of that energy that is available to be used for actual physical work. The rest is just wasted heat.
Oh, I see.
So when we say measure exergy, we mean you have to decouple physical availability from actual value creation. Reward the deep work output over the instant Slack reply. Measure the work, not the heat.
Now, before we wrap up, the text offers a brief advanced look at the future of elite organization, a concept called Digital Stigmergy.
This is fascinating. In complex biological systems like ant colonies, coordination is achieved through stigmergy. Rather than relying on direct one-to-one interactions, which creates a massive explosion of communication overhead, ants coordinate indirectly by leaving pheromone trails in their environment.
Elite organizations will shift the burden of state maintenance entirely onto their digital environment.
So instead of pinging a coworker to ask, "Is this done?" you just look at the shared digital environment. The environment holds the state.
You coordinate indirectly by modifying the shared environment, committing code, shifting a priority tag. It bypasses the context thrashing of the human brain entirely. The text also frames this using a concept called RF impedance matching. The digital systems we use transmit demands at gigabit velocity, but the human prefrontal cortex is biologically capped at processing roughly 40 to 60 bits per second.
It's a massive mismatch. The silicon exoskeleton wrapping around your office is operating at gigabits per second. Billions of bits. Your brain, the carbon core, is capped at roughly 40 to 60 bits per second.
40 to 60 bits, that's it.
That is just, it's absurd.
It is the biological hard disk. You cannot hack it. You cannot bypass it with a new productivity app or a new journal.
Right.
When a legacy manager forces a high-frequency digital signal, constant chat pings, into a low-bandwidth human receiver, that mismatch occurs. The unabsorbed tasks are reflected back into the system, generating destructive friction that ultimately results in burnout.
So the future organization must engineer digital filters that automatically step down signal frequencies before they hit the biological core. But until that infrastructure exists, you, the listener, must serve as that localized filter. You must enforce the phase boundary manually.
Shield the core, batch the inputs, protect your exergy.
Which brings us to our final thought. As you log in tomorrow, look at your dashboard. Look at your team's communication. Are you tracking actual kinetic velocity, deep work, code commits, final outputs? Or are you just measuring thermal vibration, meeting attendance, the speed of chat replies, the illusion of the green dot? We urge you to become the Maxwell's demon for your team.
Which is a great reference. Wait, you've used that term before, but remind me what a Maxwell's demon is in this context.
In physics, Maxwell's demon is a theoretical gatekeeper that controls a door between two chambers, only letting fast-moving particles through to create clean energy while blocking the chaotic, slow-moving ones.
So you have to be the gatekeeper that blocks the chaotic noise, build those phase boundaries. And we are far from finished with this structural diagnostic. But as we close out today's deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought that builds on Landauer's principle. We've established that every single digital interruption forces a permanent heat-generating erasure in our cognitive RAM. But what happens to the human capacity for deep empathy, for complex emotional resonance, and for long-term philosophical thought when we are subjected to a lifetime of forced, continuous context thrashing? Does the digital hive mind not just burn our ATP, but actively overwrite our fundamental humanity?
It's a chilling question. If we are constantly erasing our working memory every 2 minutes, what aspects of our deeper selves are we permanently failing to load?
Exactly. Are we just seizing up the internal pump of our own minds, pouring in more digital notifications and expecting a perfectly brewed output? Just like that break-in coffee machine generating nothing but waste heat until the system finally melts down for good.
Imagine you are at the end of a long, productive meeting. Or maybe you are hosting an event, or even recording a deep dive like we are right now.
You're in the zone.
You are in the middle of doing a graceful professional sign-off. You are bringing it home. You're summarizing the points. Your tone is measured. You're paying attention to the audience's social cues.
You are packaging the task up with a neat little bow to put it away.
Exactly.
Neurologically, your brain is highly specialized in that exact moment. It is firing on all cylinders to execute a very specific social and professional script.
Yes. You are quite literally decelerating towards a comfortable, planned destination. You see your driveway approaching?
You're almost home.
And right in the middle of that graceful sign-off, someone suddenly interrupts you. But they don't ask a Boolean question. They don't ask if you want coffee.
Oh, no.
They ask you to explain your entire marketing strategy for the next quarter.
Ugh, it is physically painful just to think about.
Or, even better, they ask if you figured out the complex logistics for a massive event next month.
Like, hey, before you wrap up, did you finalize the caterers, the seating chart, and the AV equipment for the 500-person gala in 4 weeks?
Yes. We hear it all the time. Just a quick question before we sign off.
This completely changes the dynamic of how we communicate with each other in the workplace, because the person asking that question likely thinks they are just casually slipping in a quick query before you go.
Right, they think they're tossing a speed bump into your path.
But the cognitive reality, the biological demand they have just placed on your brain is drastically different.
It's severe.
It really is. Unlike the speed bump, a complex question like outlining a quarterly marketing strategy or detailing event logistics forces your brain into a catastrophic working memory failure.
A failure.
Yes, it forces you to literally slam on the brakes.
It's not a dip in speed. It's a dead stop.
A complete dead stop.
And the reason it's a dead stop goes back to that RAM analogy. My working memory was entirely filled with the graceful sign-off schema. I was monitoring tone, concluding thoughts, saying goodbye.
Right. Your RAM was full.
Suddenly, to answer a question about next quarter's marketing strategy, I can't just run a tiny background process. I have to completely flush my RAM.
Exactly. You have to drop everything you are holding. You have to access a completely different part of your brain, retrieve massive files regarding future planning, financial logistics, vendor coordination.
All from long-term memory.
Yes, and load all of that abstract strategy back into your active workspace.
You can't just lift your foot off the gas.
Yeah.
You have to rip the emergency brake.
Precisely. But the researchers don't stop at just slamming on the brakes. The true cost of the Landauer threshold being crossed is what happens next.
Oh man, it gets so much worse.
Yeah.
And so visceral. The researchers know that when you get hit with a complex interruption like this, your brain doesn't just stop. It is forced to do a full U-turn in the mud.
Let's really analyze the mechanics of that image, because it perfectly maps to what is happening at a synaptic level.
It really does. Because a U-turn means you are no longer facing your destination.
Right.
The graceful sign-off is behind you now. You have been forcibly spun around to face an entirely different direction. The future event, the next quarter's strategy.
And then there's the mud.
I love this part because the mud isn't just a fun visual. It represents a real neurological deficit,
Right.
a lack of synaptic priming.
That is the crucial element. Why is it muddy? Because your neurons weren't prepared to fire in that direction.
They were totally unprimed.
When you are hit with a complex question completely out of context, your brain lacks the solid ground of chemical preparation. If you sit down at your desk at 9 a.m. to specifically work on the marketing strategy, the road is paved.
You have your notes, your spreadsheets.
Yes, and your neural pathways are warmed up and primed for those specific concepts. But when you are ambushed with it while trying to sign off...
You have absolutely no traction. Your neurons are cold.
Exactly. You are in the mud, your cognitive tires are spinning, you are grasping for names, dates, budgets, trying to formulate a coherent answer while your brain is slipping and sliding.
Because it wasn't preloaded with the necessary information.
It is incredibly inefficient, and it requires a massive spike in cognitive effort just to form a basic sentence.
I can literally feel the exhaustion of that mud.
Next time in Part 6, we will explore queuing physics and the 100% efficiency trap. We will reveal exactly why pushing a team to be 100% busy mathematically guarantees infinite gridlock and total systemic collapse.
It is entirely counterintuitive to everything we've been taught, and it is going to blow your mind.
Keep your phase boundaries strong, and we will see you next time.